Hi guys, welcome back to the Literary Archives. Today is first chapter, First Friday, and we're going to be reading another one of my all-time favorites, Rebecca by Daphne Du Maurier. This is a haunting beauty, and I hope you're ready for it. Rebecca first caught my eye around 2018 when it was included in a book club that an actor was hosting. And at the time I thought, it sounds interesting, I might pick it up. But I didn't, and years went past, and finally this book kept coming back to my mind, and so I knew it was time to read it, and I am very, very glad that I did. So Rebecca is about a young woman who becomes the second wife of Maxim de Winter. And he is a wealthy man, and so they move to his mansion, Manderley Mansion. But when she gets there, she's struggling to kind of fit into her role as the new wife, because the previous wife, Rebecca de Winter, her memory is being meticulously preserved by the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. And so our new protagonist, she is struggling to fit into her role, and with every suspense, secrets start to bubble to the surface, questions are left unanswered, and the life that she is trying to build is beginning to ebb away beneath her. Chapter 1. Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I could not enter, for the way was barred to me. There was a padlock and a chain upon the gate. I called in my dream to the lodge keeper and had no answer, and peering closer through the rusted spokes of the gate, I saw that the lodge was uninhabited. No smoke came from the chimney, and the little lattice windows gaped forlorn. Then, like all dreamers, I was possessed of a sudden with supernatural powers and passed like a spirit through the barrier before me. The drive wound away in front of me, twisting and turning as it had always done, but as I advanced I was aware that a change had come upon it. It was narrow and unkept, not the drive that we had known. At first I was puzzled and did not understand, and it was only when I bent my head to avoid the low swinging branch of a tree that I realized what had happened. Nature had come into her own again, and little by little, in her stealthy, insidious way, had encroached upon the drive with long, tenacious fingers. The woods, always a menace, even in the past, had triumphed in the end. They crowded, dark and uncontrolled, to the borders of the drive. The beeches with white naked limbs leaned closer to one another, their branches intermingled in a strange embrace, making a vault above my head like the archway of a church. And there were other trees as well, trees that I did not recognize, squat oaks and tortured elms that straggled cheek by jowl with the beeches, and had thrust themselves out of the quiet earth along with monster shrubs and plants, none of which I remembered. The drive was a ribbon now, a thread of its former self, with gravel surface gone and choked with grass and moss. The trees had thrown out long branches, making an impediment to progress. The gnarled roots looked like skeleton claws. Scattered here and again amongst the jungle growth, I would recognize shrubs that had been landmarks in our time, things of culture and of grace, hydrangeas whose blue heads had been famous. No hand had checked their progress, and they had gone native now, rearing to monster height without a bloom, black and ugly as the nameless parasites that grew beside them. On and on, now east, now west, wound the poor thread that once had been our drive. Sometimes I thought it lost, but it appeared again, beneath a fallen tree perhaps, or struggling on the other side of a muddy ditch created by the winter rains. I had not thought the way so long. Surely the miles had multiplied, even as the trees had done, and this path led but to a labyrinth, some choked wilderness, and not to the house at all. I came upon it suddenly, the approach masked by the unnatural growth of a vast shrub that spread in all directions, and I stood, my heart thumping in my breast, the strange prick of tears behind my eyes. There was Manderley, our Manderley, secretive and silent as it had always been, the gray stone shining in the moonlight of my dream, the mullioned windows reflecting the green lawns and the terrace. Time could not wreck the perfect symmetry of those walls, not the site itself, a jewel in the hollow of a hand. The terrace sloped to the lawns, and the lawns stretched to the sea, and turning I could see the sheet of silver, placid under the moon, like a lake undisturbed by wind or storm. No waves would come to ruffle the stream water, and no bulk of cloud, wind driven from the west, obscure the clarity of this pale sky. I turned again to the house, and though it stood inviolate, untouched, and as though we ourselves had left but yesterday, I saw that the garden had obeyed the jungle law, even as the woods had done. The rhododendrons stood 50 feet high, twisted and entwined with bracken, and they had entered into alien marriage with a host of nameless shrubs, poor bastard things that clung about the roots, as though conscious of their spurious origin. A lilac had mated with a copper beech, and to bind them yet more closely to one another, the malevolent ivy, always an enemy to grace, had thrown her tendrils about the pair and made them prisoners. Ivy held prior place in this lost garden. The long strands crept across the lawns, and soon would encroach upon the house itself. There was another plant, too, some half-breed from the woods, whose seed had been scattered long ago beneath the trees, and then forgotten, and now, marching in unison with the ivy, thrust its ugly form like a giant rhubarb towards the soft grass where the daffodils had blown. Nettles were everywhere, the vanguard of the army. They choked the terrace, they sprawled about the paths, they leant, vulgar and lanky, against the very windows of the house. They made indifferent sentinels, for in many places their ranks had been broken by the rhubarb plant, and they lay with crumpled heads and listless stems, making a pathway for the rabbits. I left the drive and went on to the terrace, for the nettles were no barrier to me, a dreamer. I walked enchanted, and nothing held me back. Moonlight can play odd tricks upon the fancy, even upon a dreamer's fancy. As I stood there, hushed and still, I could swear that the house was not an empty shell, but lived and breathed as it had before. Light came from the windows, the curtains blew softly in the night air, and there in the library the door would stand half open as we had left it, with my handkerchief on the table beside the bowl of autumn roses. The room would bear witness to our presence. The little heap of library books marked ready to return, and the discarded copy of the Times. Ashtrays with the stub of a cigarette, cushions with the imprint of our heads upon them, lolling in the chairs, the charred embers of our log fire still smoldering against the morning. And Jasper, dear Jasper, with his soulful eyes and great sagging jowl, would be stretched upon the floor, his tail a thump when he heard his master's footsteps. A cloud, hitherto unseen, came upon the moon and hovered an instant like a dark hand before a face. The illusion went with it, and the lights in the house, or the lights in the windows, were extinguished. I looked upon a desolate shell, soulless at last, unhaunted, with no whisper of the past about its staring walls. The house was a sepulchre. Our fear and suffering lay buried in the ruins. There would be no resurrection. When I thought of Manderley in my waking hours, I would not be bitter. I should think of it as it might have been, could I have lived there without fear. I should remember the rose garden in summer, and the birds that sang at dawn, tea under the chestnut tree, and the murmur of the sea coming up to us from the lawns below. I would think of the brown lilac and the happy valley. These things were permanent, and they could not be dissolved. They were memories that cannot hurt. All this I resolved in my dream, while the clouds lay across the face of the moon, for like most sleepers, I knew that I dreamed. In reality, I lay many hundred miles away in an alien land, and would wake, before many seconds had passed, in the bare little hotel bedroom, comforting in its very lack of atmosphere. I would sigh a moment, stretch myself and turn, and opening my eyes, be bewildered at that glittering sun, that hard, clean sky, so different from the soft moonlight of my dream. The day would lie before us both, long, no doubt, and uneventful, but fraught with a certain stillness, a dear tranquility we had not known before. We would not talk of Manderley. I would not tell my dream, for Manderley was ours no longer. Manderley was no more. One of the things I find most intriguing about Rebecca is the idea that it is a romantic suspense. In my mind, these are two genres that are very classically defined and don't go together. And so to try to wrap my mind around how you have romance and suspense together in the same book baffled me. But after reading Rebecca and even other Daphne Du Maurier books, I see how they work beautifully. The romance element brings in the pain and reality of love, while the suspense brings in the fear of the unknown and the questioning and the feelings of suspense. And so they work really well together, especially when you have a haunting setting like Manderley is described as in that opening chapter. Another thing I find really interesting about Rebecca is that Daphne Du Maurier never gives our central character a first name. She's only ever referred to as Madam or Mrs. De Winter. I feel like this adds to her anonymity and her lack of voice, because without her first name, she's more easily swept into the shadows of her own life. While Rebecca, who still lives on in name and the preservation by Mrs. Danvers, she still commands Manderley House, even though she's gone. And so that unique writing style also kind of leads into one of the major themes of this novel, which is the difference between a good and an evil woman. Potential spoilers, but Rebecca ruled her house with cruelty, and she used fear and manipulation to get what she wanted. But the new Mrs. De Winter, she comes in and she's very kind and she's thoughtful, and it keeps her a little bit meek at first. She is a weak character and she is not running her house. She's allowing it to be ran by Mrs. Danvers, aka Rebecca, because Mrs. Danvers is doing it the way that Rebecca always did it. But as she learns more about Maxim and Manderley House itself, she begins to find her sense of self, and she never loses sight of her humble beginnings and the values that she has towards others, and the gentleness that she shows, and that eventually wins over Manderley House and everyone in it, giving her a sense of purpose and place. Thank you for joining me for First Chapter, First Friday. If you enjoyed this reading and review of Rebecca, please like and subscribe so you never miss a literary moment, and I will see you next time.